That's the short history. Where are we today? We are mired in two conflicts that are absolutely, unbelievably insane. One is Ukraine, and the other is Gaza. They're very different conflicts. One is in the heart of Europe, one is in the heart of the Levant, if you will, with our erstwhile ally, Israel. But they have some characteristics that are similar. The first one is they are both insane. Doesn't make any sense whatsoever what we're doing in either place. And let me start with Ukraine for just a minute or two. Back to that sketch I gave you, but not very far. Back to the end of the Cold War. I was there with my boss. He was there with Ronald Reagan when he was National Security Advisor to Ronald Reagan, his last one, and then the deputy before that. So 2 years with Reagan. And those 2 years were also with H.W. Bush, who was then the vice president for 8 years for Ronald Reagan. He was there in St. Catherine's Palace with Gorbachev. He was there on Long Island with H.W. Bush, Reagan, and Gorbachev. He was there with Shevardnadze when they did the Shevardnadze was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union / Russia at that time. Really Mikhail Gorbachev's right-hand man. We were all there when we said, in essence, hey, this is a really special moment. And Gorbachev was a special creature in that moment. We're going to take advantage of this. And Bush said, we are not going to beat our chests. That was his exact words. We are not going to beat our chests. We're not going to trumpet our victory. We're not going to step on them with track shoes. We're going to establish some sort of regime, he called it the New World Order, in the world, that will live up to the very standards we put in the UN Charter. That's what we're going to try to do. And Helmut Kohl, Chancellor of Germany, a brilliant man, Francois Mitterrand in France, Maggie Thatcher and John Major in England, and others, were on the phone every day trying to discuss what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. When Helmut Kohl was told that maybe he could reunify Germany, he was stunned. He didn't know whether he wanted to. Smart man. First of all, it was going to cost, by their own estimates, 80 billion US. It wound up costing about 200 billion US. But that was the projection at that time, and that was really formidable from Bonn's perspective, West Germany's perspective. Then when he was told that Gorbachev would probably let him stay in NATO if he reunified, he was thunderstruck. He couldn't believe it. And initially, he was against it. Why? Because he knew that Moscow's vibes would be a little negative, no matter what Gorbachev said. He has to live with that 11 time zone country. And so he was a little bit concerned. He wanted to do it. He wanted to be the chancellor who reunified Germany, and he wanted to stay in NATO, but really uneasy about it. H.W. Bush took care of that unease. And so did Mikhail Gorbachev. And Francois Mitterrand came right along too. One of the reasons was because both Jim Baker, H.W.'s Secretary of State, and H.W. himself told Gorbachev, if all of this comes to pass, NATO will not move 1 inch further east. Now, today, Bill Clinton and a host of other neophyte asses have essentially said that was just a spoken word, and that's not sealing. You know, gentlemen's words are not treaties. That's right out of Bill Clinton's mouth, as a matter of fact. Well, I'm sorry. That's not the world I grew up in. The world I grew up in is your word is your bond, whether you're a diplomat, a president, or whatever. Well, so we just violated that, and we've been violating it ever since. Anatoly Chubai and Larry Summers, you've heard that name before, I'm sure, raped, pillaged, and plundered Moscow with fire sales of all the old Soviet Union hard assets to the oligarchs. and the fees they gained off of that increased, for example, Harvard's endowment by about $19.6 billion overnight. Was Larry Summers really fired because he made some impolitic remarks about women in science? Or was he fired because Harvard figured out where the money came from? Didn't give it back, of course. Russia, in other words, has no reason to believe or respect or to have anything to do with Washington. And Putin tried, and I have no love for Vladimir Putin, but he tried time and time again to prevent having to use troops in Ukraine. He even gave us a dramatic example. My president, George W. Bush, neophyte par excellence, went to Tbilisi, and standing beside that young president, Saakashvili, who is now mayor of Odessa, show you how Georgians get around, stood right there beside him in the public square and said Georgia would be a member of NATO in the future. What did Putin do? He invaded, took the two northwestern oblasts, for all practical purposes, still some Russian troops there. What would we think he'd do with Ukraine? Much, much, much more strategic. Of course he's going to invade. But this time he decided, I think, he was going to teach us a little bit of a lesson. And he really didn't invade to take Kyiv. He didn't invade to do anything but to teach those Johnny-come-latelys in Kyiv, who were being backed to the hilt by us and had been since 2002. I was there, remember? Didn't leave the State Department until 2005. I was there with Timoshenko and Yevtushenko and all those criminals, because that's what they were. Yulia Timoshenko was even that. We had been fomenting the situation in Ukraine since at least 2002, and big time since 2006 and 7, when the European commander, 4-star Air Force General Philip Breedlove, used to get on his Harley, yes, and ride down the Autobahns and on down into Ukraine and talk with the Azov Battalion and others like that. We have been in Ukraine fomenting all manner of unrest to get at Russia. Weak, very weak. We can take them on. We can take them on. So all the neoconservatives came out of the woodwork. Okay, let's finish Russia off before we do China. And Ukraine was the way we were going to do it. Wrong, people. Wrong. You misjudge, misestimated George W. Bush. Russia. Yeah, Russia lost in 1917. Had a lot of other things going on, though, in World War I. Oh, yeah, well, Russia's been beaten before, you know, blah, blah, blah. I've heard all the arguments. 11 time zones. You don't go to war with a country of 150 million people of 11 time zones, the strategic depth like no other country in the world, with roughly 38 million in Ukraine. You just don't do it. Even if you've got NATO behind you, you don't have anything but their arms behind you and their money. That's not going to beat the Russians. So now we're in a mess, complete mess. They have lost. They have lost so badly. If you're familiar with von Clausewitz and his Vom Krieg on war, you understand that war has its own dynamic. And every day that dynamic changes. Well, right now, the Russian military and Putin are looking at the dynamic favoring them, which says, why stop now? They didn't want all of Ukraine. What would he want with all of Ukraine? He'd have a guerrilla war on his hands. If you've not looked at Napoleon and how the Ukrainian partisans fell on him, or you haven't looked at the Nazis, or for that matter, the Russians themselves, whom the Ukrainian partisans fell on, they didn't give a hoot who you were, communist, Marxist, capitalist, or whatever. They're bloody-minded people. They would fall on you and kill you and take your gold teeth. And that's what we're talking about. That's really what we're talking about. It hasn't changed a whole lot. He didn't want that. All he wanted was a little bit of control over those portions of Ukraine where dominant Russian populations existed and were being treated very terribly. And he was right. They were. As Ukraine's leadership changed, the pendulum swung one way and the other. But a lot of that pendulum was being pushed by us and by the British. Oh, don't let me forget perfidious Albion. I don't even recognize London anymore. I don't even recognize the British people anymore. They're right in there, in for a penny, in for a pound. I'm going to put some troops into. Oh, do you know your military is about as big as a battalion of the American military? The British military is so small, you could put it in Ukraine, it'd be subsumed in 15 minutes. So where are we there? We're at a point where they have lost, and we're killing people still, even though they've lost. And we have a leader in Zelensky who's courageous, valorous, brave, use all the adjectives you want to, but hasn't a clue how to get out of this. So he's got to go. Got to have somebody in there who's interested in the future of Ukraine. And he's got to have somebody in Washington that backs that. Won't happen until the election's over, because Joe Biden has been told by his advisors, and I think Joe himself thinks, and I've known him for a long time, that he can't get reelected if he's seen as cutting and running. So he's going to do an LBJ. LBJ knew that George Bush was right. He knew that he couldn't win in Vietnam. Quote from LBJ, a direct quote, "Oh ho, ain't going to be moved by no bombs." This is when he's being told by the Air Force that he should kill 2.5 million Vietnamese with more iron bombs than we dropped in World War II on Germany. Why? And 30,000 more names on that big black marble wall down in Washington. Why? Because I don't want to be seen as cutting and running. Prestige, what Dean Acheson called the shadow of power. Prestige. A lot of things wrapped up in that word with Joe Biden and Ukraine, too. Don't want to be proved so blatantly wrong. That's where we are in Ukraine. Gaza, another matter altogether. We are